So, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to our guest lecture today, or tonight, I guess, depending on where you are in the world. And I can see many people from many different parts of the world. So, our guest lecture today is by John Zaleski, and he will basically tell us about the relationship of Muslims and Christians during the medieval times. So during the medieval times, their interaction with each other, on issues of the Muslim asceticism and Christian monasticism and their interactions with one another. John Zaleski is a humanities research fellow at NYU Abu Dhabi. He received his PhD from Harvard University, and he is currently writing a monograph on Muslim-Christian exchange concerning ascetic practice. As part of this project, he has also examined the history of Christian monasticism in the Gulf region. So I'm assuming maybe, John, you might have went to Sayr Ben Yas for the Christian monastery over there. So his articles on Muslim-Christian exchange as well as on early Sufism have recently been published in the Oxford Journal of Islamic Studies and in Medieval Encounters. So thank you so much, John, for being with us, and the screen is all yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Abdullah, for the introduction, and thank you to you and to Khalifa University for this kind invitation. I've been looking forward to speaking with all of you. So I'll be speaking today about Christian monasticism in the early Islamic world and about the interactions between Muslims and Christian monks. Now, several statements from the Quran and from the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad appear critical of Christian monasticism. Most famously, perhaps, there is the hadith, "There is no monasticism in Islam." In spite of this critical attitude, however, many early Muslims held Christian monks in high esteem and recognized affinities between Islamic and Christian ascetic practice. In this talk, I'll be examining the dual nature of this Islamic response to monasticism, the critique of monasticism, as well as the interest and appreciation shown by Muslims for the practices of Christian monks. So in the first half of the talk, I'm going to introduce the place of Christian monasticism in the early Islamic world, focusing on medieval Iraq. After that, I will discuss the development of Islamic attitudes toward monasticism. In the second half of the talk, I'll provide a case study in Muslim monastic exchange by focusing on a recent research subject of mine, a series of traditions that appear in both medieval Islamic and Christian sources concerning the black woolen robe worn by Christian monks. I thought about wearing a black woolen robe for this talk, but I didn't want the image of me like that to live on forever on YouTube. So now this black woolen robe, this visible symbol of piety, was used by Muslims and Christians alike to convey shared ideals of asceticism, as well as to critique the practices of rival groups. Christian and Muslim stories about the monastic robe thus reveal a mutual exchange of ideas about asceticism, an exchange that shaped both Muslim and Christian ideals of piety in the early Islamic world. So first, Christian monasticism in the world of early Islam. The Christian monks of the early Islamic Middle East spoke, wrote, and prayed in the Syriac language, a dialect of Aramaic, and as a result, they are known as Syriac Christians. In fact, there were several different Syriac Christian churches in the Islamic world, and these churches often competed with each other for converts, resources, and patronage. Today, I'll be focusing my remarks on the Syriac community known as the Church of the East. This was the most populous and intellectually prolific Christian church in Iraq at the time of the Islamic conquest. Due to the work of its missionaries, who established an ecclesiastical network stretching along the Silk Road from Syria to China, the Church of the East was also perhaps the largest Christian community in the world. Christians belonging to the Church of the East are typically called East Syrians, or in older texts and occasionally in pejorative contexts, Nestorians. Now, the Church of the East, and more broadly Syriac Christian monasticism, continued to grow in the early Islamic world, including in Iraq, the region that is the focus of my remarks today. Early Muslim sources often describe Christian monks as wild, solitary figures, haunting the mountains and roaming through the deserted valleys of the Islamic world. In one such account, for example, an early Muslim ascetic named Abdul Wahid ibn Zayd comes across a monk hiding in a cave in a river valley. "How long have you been here?" Abdul Wahid asks him. 30 years, the monk replies. "Then who are your companions?" Abdul Wahid asks. "Wild animals," the monk answers. Abdul Wahid leaves this encounter somewhat unsure whether the savage figure he has met is a human or a jinn. Now, these sorts of stories reflect an earlier, unregimented form of Christian asceticism that developed in pre-Islamic Syria and Iraq. Famous saints like Simeon the Stylite lived on top of pillars. Another group of ascetics, known as the Boskoi, or grazers, fed upon the grass like sheep. Nevertheless, already by the 5th century, a more sedate ascetic life that had been established by monks in Egypt had come to flourish within Syria and Iraq, supplanting earlier, more idiosyncratic forms of asceticism. Syriac monks in the Islamic world typically lived in communal monasteries. These were often organized on what is called a lavra model, with separate cells for individual monks surrounding a common area that housed novices and a church for communal prayer. So while some monks did embrace a solitary life, they did so within the broader context of a monastic organization that promoted the interdependence of communal and solitary asceticism. Syriac Christians continued to build and populate these communal monasteries throughout the Umayyad and Abbasid Middle East, both in Upper Mesopotamia, one of the old heartlands of Syriac monasticism, as well as further south by Basra and into the Gulf. Some of you here in Abu Dhabi may be aware of the remains of a Christian monastery which Dr. Abdullah mentioned earlier, which is now on the island of Sir Beni Yas in western Abu Dhabi. This monastery was first discovered in 1992, and originally it was dated to the 6th or 7th century. However, a more recent analysis by R.A. Carter of pottery remains at the site has pushed the dating later to the late 7th to mid-century. Now, I mention this because it's significant because it shows that the monastery was still present and active here into the period of Islamic rule. And this is a point that has been underappreciated, I would say, the continued flourishing and growth of Christian monasticism within the Islamic period in the Middle East. Now, this growth was fueled in part by the competition between different churches that I mentioned before. Monks sought to establish their monasteries in regions that were associated with a rival Christian sect. In Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, rival Christian groups established monasteries as part of an effort to gain the patronage of the new regime. These efforts could be very successful. To give one example, Timothy I, who was the head of the Church of the East in the late 8th and early 9th century, Timothy wrote in a letter that he had convinced the caliph to donate 84,000 silver dirhams, a very large sum of money, to the monastery of Marpetion, which lay in Baghdad along the Tigris River. This demonstrates how, in spite of theoretical prohibitions on the construction and repair of monasteries in the Islamic world, Syriac Christian monasticism continued to spread and even gain official approval from Muslim rulers. The book on monasteries, Kitab ad-Diyarat, a 10th century text composed by the Muslim author Ash-Shabushti, describes 53 monasteries, 37 of them in Iraq. So this proliferation of Christian monasteries raises the question of the context in which Christian monks and Muslims would have interacted. Broadly speaking, such interaction would have taken place both on monastic grounds and in urban centers. According to Islamic sources, Muslims visited monasteries for several reasons. As authors like Ash-Shabushti relate, the monasteries around Baghdad were famous for their festivals, which drew both Christian and Muslim visitors. Now, the main attraction of these festivals was likely the wine produced by monks and the general atmosphere of celebration. Yet other Islamic sources refer to Muslims visiting monks in order to converse on pious matters, and even, in one account, to consult books in monastic libraries. At the same time, it is clear that Christian monks frequently left the enclosure of their monastery and interacted with the local population in cities, markets, and other public spaces, a habit amply attested by the monastic literature that complains about this very fact. So consider the complaint, for example, of Dadisho Katraya, a Syriac monk from the Eastern Arabian Peninsula who settled in Iraq and Khuzestan. As Dadisho laments, "In past times, many were the monks who lived in silence and remained cloistered, and few were the monks who went out into the streets and entered the cities and conducted business outside the monastery. But now in our days, in a congregation in which there are 55 monks, only 5 will live in silence inside the monastery, and 50 others will toil without ceasing in business outside the monastery." Now, these numbers are not meant to be precise. Even so, they suggest that it was a common state of affairs for many monks to leave the monastery on a regular basis in order to engage in business in cities. Other Syriac monastic texts warn monks to avoid developing familiarity with people from the nearby towns when they enter these towns for business. Such texts have significant implications when we consider the social context for the interaction between monks and the non-cloistered population of the early Islamic world, including Muslims. As I would argue, the interaction between monks and Muslims took place within cities, as much as or more than it did within monastic grounds. Now, such opportunities for interaction between Muslims and Christian monks explain the deep familiarity with Christian monasticism that is evident in early Islamic sources. So here I'm going to shift to describing the Muslim understanding of and response to Christian monasticism. Early Muslim attitudes toward monasticism are best described as ambivalent. The Quran itself praises Christian monks, but also implies, at least according to what became the majority exegesis, that monasticism was an innovation of Christians. Early Muslims thus imagine monks both as faithful followers of the true message of Jesus, embracing his monotheism and his ascetic fervor, and as apostates from and innovators upon Jesus' teaching, both as models and teachers of ascetic wisdom, and as offering in their monasteries a haven from the strictures of society, where hospitality, wine, and even romantic and sexual affairs abounded. Several early Muslim ascetics were themselves called a rahib, or monk, in recognition of their severe ascetic disciplines. On the whole, however, Muslim texts about asceticism tended to define Islamic ideals of piety in opposition to Christian monasticism. For example, in a well-known hadith, the Prophet rebukes one of his companions, Uthman ibn Maz'un. Uthman, it seems, had abandoned his wife in order to take up a regimen of constant prayer and fasting. So the Prophet tells him, "I have not been commanded to monasticism. Do you hate my sunnah? My sunnah is to pray and to sleep, to fast and to eat, to marry and to divorce. And whoever hates my sunnah is not one of my own." This tradition defines proper Islamic piety in accordance with the example of moderation set by the Prophet Muhammad, and explicitly in opposition to the practice of Christian monks. Unlike monks, Muslims should marry and avoid excessive prayer and fasting. Even Islamic traditions that encourage ascetic behavior or attitudes often subtly differentiate Islamic practice from that of Christian monks. In one ascetic collection, or Kitab al-Zuhud, a companion of the Prophet named Abu Darda states, "Truly the cell of a Muslim man is his house. In it he restrains his sight, his hearing, and his pleasure. Now I want to look at this saying for a minute. I'm going to bring it up on the PowerPoint. So you'll notice the confessional term Muslim here, Rajul Muslim. This term is important here because the term cell, Sawma'a, implies the living quarters of a Christian monk. As Abu Darda suggests, if the Christian monk guards his senses in the seclusion of a monastic cell, the Muslim man should guard his senses within the home. Abu Darda was himself married, and his wife, Darda, was an authority on piety and asceticism in her own right, who was remembered for instructing both male and female students. The point of this saying of Abu Darda is that the household, and more broadly the family, is the proper context for a Muslim's ascetic withdrawal, in contrast to the celibate monk who finds solitude in his cell. In sum, early Islamic discussion about asceticism contained a significant anti-ascetic and anti-monastic strand. An effort to establish the bounds of legitimate Islamic asceticism and distinguish Islamic practice from the disciplines of Christian monks. Such anti-monastic traditions culminated in the hadith I quoted at the beginning of this talk, in which the Prophet declares, "There is no monasticism in Islam." This saying was familiar both in the medieval Islamic world and even today. Yet medieval Muslim scholars contested its authenticity and significance. Writing in the 15th century, for example, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani presented this saying as well known, but he said that he could not find it verbatim in any hadith collection. Regardless of its authenticity, however, the saying encapsulated a growing view among Muslims that monasticism, and by extension severe acts of asceticism, were contrary to the message of Islam and the Sunnah of the Prophet. However, this is only half the story. In many cases, Muslims embraced practices also associated with Christian monasticism and evinced curiosity toward and appreciation for the disciplines of Christian monks. As a case study in these complex ways in which Muslims responded to Christian monasticism, I will focus the rest of my discussion on a subject I have been exploring recently, the clothing worn by Christian monks. As I will argue, the black woolen garb worn by monks was a shared cultural symbol whose meaning was understood by Christians and Muslims alike. This meaning was partly shaped by Muslims, whose understanding of the monastic robe came ultimately to influence Christian understanding of monasticism. Now, the monastic garment was and remains today a distinctive visual symbol of the monk and his ascetic piety. Nevertheless, there does not seem to have been a standard color or style of garment used by early Christian monks. Most surviving discussion tells monks to be content with simple attire. John Cassian, who lived as a monk first in Egypt, then in Gaul, wrote that, and I quote, "A monk's garment should be such that it merely serves to cover his body, keeping away the shame of nudity and preventing injury from the cold. The garment should not be such that it nourishes the seeds of vanity or of self-conceit. So it should be basic, such that it would not be considered conspicuous among the other men of this monastic way of life, due to the novelty of the garment's color or form. The monk's clothes should thus be an expression of the monk's humility. In fact, they should nurture the monk's humility by meeting only his basic needs and reinforcing his lack of superiority over his fellow monks. In the Syriac-speaking world, monks seem to have adopted a woolen garment as symbolic of their humble ascetic profession. Evidence for this can be found in both Christian and Islamic sources. A manuscript at the Vatican Library records an early Syriac rite of investiture, that is, a ritual in which a novice monk would assume the distinctive monastic dress and so formally take on the status of a monk. According to this manuscript, at the beginning of the ritual, the novice monk will be dressed in a cotton or linen garment. The head of the monastery then comes and lays a woolen garment down on the ground and makes the new monk sit on top of it, facing east, the direction of Christian prayer. The text actually specifies that the garment is made of sheep wool. The head of the monastery then says to the novice, "See, my son, this woolen tunic is a symbol of the grave, for henceforth you are dead to this world." The new monk is then given the tonsure, the distinctive crown-shaped haircut that marks his body as monastic. Following this, the monk changes out of his cotton dress and into the garment of wool, completing his death to the world and entrance into monasticism. Similar rituals also existed in the Syriac-speaking world for nuns, who, like male ascetics, often wore black woolen garments. As seen from this rite of monastic investiture, the symbolism of the woolen garment is twofold. First, it represents the Syriac monk's departure from the world, and more broadly, his new ascetic orientation. Secondly, it represents and even creates his status as a monk, for it is by donning the woolen garment that the novice, testifying to his departure from the world, becomes a monk. This dual signification, the woolen garment as a symbol of both ascetic piety and of formal monastic status, was also understood by Muslims. To give one illustration of this, according to a Syriac chronicle, the 7th century Syriac bishop of Beth Garmai region in northern Iraq petitioned the Muslim governor of the region, named Utbah, to exempt Christian monks from paying the jizya, the poll tax. The bishop apparently held some sway with the governor because earlier the governor had asked him to pray for his daughters, and the bishop had done so, and the daughters had been miraculously healed. So in any case, this Muslim governor, Utbah, readily agreed to exempt monks from the poll tax, declaring that all those who wore woolen garments did not have to pay the jizya. Again, this indicates Islamic recognition of the woolen garment as a symbol of Christian monastic status. At the same time, several Islamic sources present both the prophets and Muslim ascetics as wearing woolen garments. The one who wears wool, an early Muslim ascetic declared, will be innocent from pride. Another famous early scholar and ascetic, named Malik ibn Dinar, was remembered as visiting Christian monasteries and conversing with monks. Like monks, he too reportedly wore a woolen garment, izar suf. In these Islamic accounts, the woolen garment is a symbol of humility and ascetic piety. Muslims who wore the woolen garment understood themselves as imitating the humble piety of the prophets. According to an early Islamic story about the prophet Jesus, when Jesus' disciples asked him, "What do you usually wear?" he answered simply, "Suf," wool. Now, in spite of the precedent set by the prophets and some early Muslim ascetics, other early Muslims expressed criticism of, or at least ambivalence toward, the practice of wearing wool. Consider the saying of Sufyan al-Thawri, an authoritative early transmitter of hadith, preserved in a late 8th century Kitab al-Zuhud, a book on asceticism. Sufyan said, "Renunciation of the world is curtailing one's hopes for this present life. It is not eating coarse food or wearing a woolen cloak." Sufyan al-Thawri here defines renunciation in opposition to wearing a woolen cloak, and instead he casts proper ascetic piety as an internal attitude of limiting one's hopes for this world. In some cases, Muslims criticize wearing wool explicitly because of the fact that Christian monks wore wool. In one account, for example, an early Muslim named Abu Aliya was visited by a friend who was wearing woolen garments, thiyab suf. But he rebuked his friend, saying, "This is the clothing of monks. As for Muslims, when they visit each other, they should make themselves beautiful." As we can see from these sources, the woolen cloak was intelligible not only to Christians, but also to Muslims as a symbol of monasticism. Precisely because of the twofold symbolism of the wool, as a sign of Christian monasticism and as a sign of humble ascetic piety, Muslims could express either approval of or criticism for wearing wool. This complex set of attitudes reflects the broader early Islamic ambivalence toward monasticism as both an inspiring form of ascetic piety and an excessive form of self-denial that exceeds the bounds of Islam. In addition to the material of the monastic garment, the color of the monastic robe was a symbol that was intelligible across confessional lines. Several Syriac Christian sources from the 5th century onward call attention to the black color of monastic garments. A meeting of bishops in the 5th century condemned heretics who dressed in black in order to deceive the simple-minded that they were legitimate monks. This indicates that the black dress was itself indicative of monastic status. By the same token, another set of Syriac rules for monks expressly forbade monks from wearing white garments. As with the woolen fabric, Christians seem to have understood the black color of the monastic robe as representing both the general state of being a monk and also the monk's ascetic orientation as someone who has departed from the world. We may consider here the words of Jacob of Edessa, an influential Syriac monk, bishop, and scholar from the 7th century. As Jacob declared, "It is not right for monks who have rejected their station and gone out to the world and taken wives to return to wearing the monastic habit, and they should not wear black garments. For many of them, deceiving people in this way, have gone out to beg in the name of monasteries, even though they have wives. Therefore, it is right that those who have gone out into the world wear white garments and not be honored by the monastic habit that they have rejected." So here, again, the black garment represents the honor of the monastic state, a symbol of the monk who has departed from the world. As a result, some monks who have re-entered the world and should therefore be wearing white have worn black in order to trick people into giving them donations. Now again, we can see from Islamic sources that Muslims were curious about the black garment of monks and its symbolic meaning. The 9th century scholar in Baghdad, Ibn Abi Dunya, collected a number of traditions from an anonymous book on monks, Kitab al-Rahban. In one of these traditions, a Muslim ascetic describes his conversation with a monk regarding the monk's black garments. So I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint here again. So as this Muslim ascetic relates, "I asked one of the monks about his black dress. He said, 'Do you not see how people struck by an affliction, when a person dies among them, blacken and alter their clothes?' I asked another monk about it, and he said, 'The dress of the people in the hellfire is black. So those who labor for God like to make their hearts aware of this whenever they gaze at their own clothing.'" Now here the black dress of the monks conveys their austere and even morbid piety to the Muslim ascetic. The black monastic garb recalls the clothing of mourners. Even more, it recalls the clothing of those who are burnt in the fires of hell. By donning the black dress in this life, monks seek to avoid wearing the black dress in the afterlife. A similar version of this encounter is related by the great Baghdadi scholar Ibn Qutayba. As Ibn Qutayba relates, Zayd al-Himyari said, "I said to Thawban the monk, 'Inform me about this black clothing of the Christians. What meaning lies in it?' He said, 'It resembles the clothing of people struck by afflictions.' I said, 'Have all of you monks been struck by an affliction?' He said, 'God have mercy on you. What affliction is greater than the afflictions of sins upon those who commit them?'" This account elaborates the idea that the monastic garb mimics the dress of mourners. Monks wear black to remind themselves of their sins, which represent the greatest affliction a person may endure. These ideas roughly recall the words of the East Syrian rite of monastic investiture, where the abbot describes the novice monk's garment as a symbol of the grave, marking his death to the world. Yet in Islamic sources, these ideas crystallized into an understanding of monks as people of spiritual affliction, mourning their sins and fearing hell. In this way, the black monastic garb represented to Muslims an extreme form of ascetic ideals such as repentance, weeping, and fear of hellfire that also characterized the lives of early Muslim ascetics. Now, I've also identified another much longer version of this same story in a Christian manuscript from Iraq, dating from around the 14th century. This manuscript is currently held in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. In this account, an unnamed person relates an encounter with a monk from Najran in southwestern Arabia. As he relates, "I passed by a monk while he was in his cell. I called to him many times until he came out to me. He was possessed of a comely gray head of hair, crowned by the light of his countenance. He had a set of black prayer beads, and on his head was a black cloak, and in his hands was a black staff. The monk explains that he is a servant of the All-Merciful, Abdurrahman, as well as a follower of the Christian religion. The main part of their conversation, however, centers on the monk's distinctive black dress. As the relator of the story reports, I said to him, 'Monk, what is your name?' He said, 'My name is Tuban.' I said, 'Whose servant are you?' He said, 'I am a servant of the All-Merciful.' I said, 'Why do you wear black?' He said, 'Because it is the clothing of people struck by afflictions.' I said, 'What affliction has struck you?' And he said, 'What affliction is greater than sins?' Now, if we compare this exchange to the account related by Ibn Qutayba, it becomes apparent that they both derive from the same core story about a monk expounding the meaning of the monastic garment. We can point out a number of correspondences here. First, both accounts have a connection. The slides on my PowerPoint had highlights to some of the points I wanted to point out here, so I'll mention them instead. So both accounts have a connection to southwestern Arabia. So you see Zayd al-Himyari is the relator in the account by Ibn Qutayba, and then a report concerning a monk from the land of Najran. In both accounts, the name of the monk is the same, except for a change in the initial dental consonant, Thauban versus Tuban. This name Tuban probably reflects the Syriac Tubana, which means blessed. Most importantly, in both cases, the monk explains the black monastic robe as mimicking the dress of mourners, Ahl al-Masa'ib. When asked what affliction has been visited upon monks, the monk answers rhetorically by asking what affliction is greater than sins. Now it's remarkable that a story about the monastic robe that seems to have developed among Muslims and in Islamic collections reappears later in expanded form in a Christian manuscript. At a minimum, this indicates the exchange of ideas about asceticism and monasticism between medieval Christians and Muslims. Yet even more, it suggests that the very way in which Christians understood a central symbol of Christian piety, the monastic robe, came to be shaped by Islamic reflection upon this same symbol. And this points me to the broader conclusion of my research on monasticism in the Islamic world. Islamic understandings of asceticism, formed partly in response to Christian monasticism, ultimately influenced how Christians themselves understood the ascetic and monastic life. I'm honored to have shared one piece of this argument with you today, and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, John. It's really lovely, and I have many questions myself. So thank you so much for this really enjoyable talk.